On a Monday morning, Alexandra Reed walked into Carter Mills's garage with a legal envelope and a cold smile. She did not bother with explanations. The lease was terminated immediately, violation of Clause 14b, language so precise it left no room for argument. Carter had exactly 21 days to vacate. In her eyes, he was nothing more than a grease-stained mechanic raising a child alone, easy to remove, easier to forget. But Alexandra Reed had never once thought to ask why Carter Mills had walked away from his vice president chair at Meridian Auto Group to pick up a wrench. Stay right here, because what Carter Mills quietly did over those next 21 days is something you will not believe. The lights in Carter Mills's garage came on at 5:30 every morning without exception. 3 bays wide, tucked into the east block of the Harwick Industrial Park, the building was unremarkable from the street. No sign, no banner, no name painted above the roll-up door. Just a strip of fluorescent light bleeding beneath the steel frame and the faint sound of a jazz station drifting from an old transistor radio propped on a shelf near the back wall. Carter had kept it exactly where he found it on his first day, 4 years ago. He didn't know why. He supposed some things were better left in the place they had always been. Inside the garage, the story was entirely different. A 1968 Porsche 911 Carrera sat gleaming under the center bay lights, its hood open, awaiting a valve seal replacement that Carter had sourced from a specialist in Stuttgart after 2 domestic suppliers came up short on spec. Beside it, a Jaguar XE with a transmission that had been slipping for 6 months and had already defeated 2 other shops in the county. At the far end of the third bay, a Bentley Continental, mid-1990s, silver over tobacco leather, a little tired around the edges in the way of things that were built too well to simply die, rested on a hydraulic lift with the quiet patience of an old object that had learned to wait. Carter's clients did not find him through advertisements or street-facing signage. They found him through each other, through a quiet and self-selecting network of people who cared about machines the way some people care about art, people who could tell the difference between competent and correct, and who were willing to drive 40 minutes for the latter. Carter had never turned a customer away for lack of a logo above the door. His phone vibrated against the workbench at 20 minutes past 7. He glanced at the screen, and a brief, unguarded expression crossed his face, the kind that appears and disappears before a person has consciously produced it. He turned the phone face down, slid it into his pocket. He would call back after work. Some conversations deserved quiet around them. He picked up his ratchet and slid back under the Bentley, and the garage settled back into its honest sounds. Carter Mills, 38 years old, had lived in Harwick for 4 years in the manner of a man who has decided not to be found. His neighbors in the industrial park knew him as competent, low-key, and precise, a single father who kept long hours and never caused problems and never explained himself. Not one of them knew what he had done before he came here. Not one had asked. Carter had offered nothing, and the silence had held the shape he'd cut for it. Alexandra Reed was not the kind of person who allowed herself to be surprised by anything she had not already accounted for. At 41, she had spent 15 years navigating industries that punished hesitation and rewarded decisiveness, and she had developed the specific confidence of someone who had been right often enough that the practice of questioning herself had atrophied. She was the chief executive officer of Voss Industries, a precision automotive components manufacturer headquartered 20 minutes from Harwick, and the company's portfolio of industrial real estate in the East Block was, at this particular moment, the single most important financial instrument she controlled. She needed that block cleared, contracted, and transferred to Crestline Group before the end of the current fiscal quarter. The cash from the sale would address a gap she had not yet spoken about openly. She arrived at Carter's garage on that Monday morning with a lawyer named Bradley and an assistant whose tablet was already open, and she walked through the entrance of Bay 1 as though she had always owned the floor beneath her, which in legal terms she had. Carter heard the heels first. He was deep under the Bentley with the radio and the ratchet, and the sound of high heels on poured concrete was not a sound his garage produced. He slid out slowly on the creeper, stood up without wiping his hands, and looked at the 3 people standing just inside his entrance. He said nothing. Alexandra looked at him in the specific way of someone cataloging what they see and concluding it is less than expected. She introduced herself in 3 words, name, title, company, and opened the folder without further ceremony. Voss Industries was exercising its right under Clause 14b of the commercial lease agreement currently governing Carter's use of the premises. The violation had been assessed and documented. Carter's operation of a private commission-based vehicle restoration service fell outside the category of standard automotive maintenance as defined in the original lease. The notice was formal and dated that morning. Carter had 21 days to vacate the property in its entirety. Following that period, the building would pass to Crestline Group as part of the larger transfer already in motion. Carter took the folder. He read through it completely, unhurried, front to back. Alexandra waited. Her lawyer clasped his hands, the assistant stylist hovered. When Carter finished, he looked up and said in a flat and even voice that Clause 14B had been present in every lease agreement across the Harwick East block for more than a decade, and to his knowledge had never been enforced against a single sitting tenant. Alexandra held his gaze without movement. "It is being enforced now," she said. Carter handed the folder back. He did not argue, he did not raise his voice. He stood in the center of his garage with his hands at his sides and watched them cross the threshold on their way out. The roll-up door descended. The radio kept playing. The Bentley kept waiting on its lift. That evening, Carter drove to Owen Calloway's house and sat at the kitchen table with the folder between them. Owen was a lawyer by credential and a friend by the long habit of proximity. They had known each other since before Harwick, and Owen was the sole person in town who understood the full geometry of Carter's life. He read through the termination notice twice, set it flat on the table, and pressed 2 fingers to his temple. The clause, he said, had been drafted with a deliberateness that went beyond standard boilerplate. Taking it to court was possible. It would take 3 to 4 months and would cost more in disruption than Carter could afford in a 21-day window. Owen looked at him across the kitchen. "You want to use the old hand," he said quietly. Carter looked out at the dark through the window above the sink. He held that silence for a while. Then he said, "Not yet." Owen nodded once. He understood that not yet was not the same as no. Carter Mills was thinking, and when Carter Mills was thinking, it was better to sit still and let it happen. Between day 1 and day 5, Carter made his rounds. He contacted 6 commercial real estate brokers operating in the industrial zone within a 5-kilometer radius of Harwick and walked through 3 available buildings. He left 2 refundable deposits on favorable terms. Every one of those conversations collapsed within 48 hours. The available spaces had been spoken for. The brokers were apologetic with a particular rehearsed quality that Carter recognized as practiced rather than genuine. A tenant from the East Block, a man who operated a sheet metal fabrication business, mentioned it to Carter without knowing what he was handing him. Voss Industries, the man said, had been making quiet contact with commercial property owners across the Harwick zone for the better part of the previous 4 weeks. Nothing on paper, nothing contractual. Just informal communication expressing a preference for exclusive cooperation arrangements with incoming anchor tenants. It was not illegal, it was methodical. Alexandra Reed had not simply served Carter an eviction notice. She had locked the available exits before she knocked on his door. Carter went back to his garage that evening and opened his laptop on the workbench beside a cold cup of coffee. He had never studied Voss Industries as a business before. He had paid rent to them and nothing more. He pulled their public financial disclosures, quarterly filings, investor communications, and third-party industry analyses, and went through them the same way he worked through a diagnostic problem, without assumptions, without skipping pages, without looking for what he expected and missing what was actually there. Voss Industries manufactured high-precision automotive components, camshafts, crankshafts, differential gears, valve train assemblies. Their client base included mid-market and premium vehicle brands, but their single largest customer was Apex Automotive, a Tier 1 supplier whose own output fed 3 major vehicle assembly lines across the country. Apex represented 34% of Voss's annual revenue. In the previous quarter, Voss had shipped a substantial batch of camshaft assemblies to Apex that had subsequently been flagged in internal review for dimensional tolerance failures. The parts had cleared initial inspection but were exhibiting cumulative deviation under sustained production conditions, failing the ISO 9001 standard for CNC machining tolerances in a way subtle enough to pass standard quality gates and consequential enough to compromise downstream assembly reliability. Apex had issued an internal notice of contract review, not yet public, indicating that the relationship would be assessed for termination within 30 days if no satisfactory technical resolution was identified and verified. Carter found this referenced in a sourcing industry analysis footnote, cross-confirmed against the cautious and specific language Voss had used in their most recent quarterly letter to shareholders. He sat back on the workbench stool and looked at the ceiling. He had been trying to understand why Alexandra Reed needed this property transaction so badly that she had served a 4-year tenant with a dubious clause rather than waiting for a natural lease expiration. Now he understood. She was not selling real estate as a strategic play. She was selling it because the company's largest revenue relationship was about to terminate, and the cash from the Harwick transfer was the fastest available stopgap. The eviction was not about Carter at all. He was a 200-square-meter inconvenience in the path of a transaction she needed to complete before the quarter closed. He looked at the laptop screen for a long time after the screen dimmed. Then he reached for his phone. The picture that had assembled itself across 2 hours of reading was precise and grim. Voss Industries was not a failed company. It was a solvent company with a structural crisis it had not yet publicly named. The cash from the Harwick real estate transfer was not a growth maneuver. It was a bridge, a way of buying time in the event that the Apex contract review went the way internal signals suggested it would. Alexandra Reed had built her quarter around a transaction that depended on Carter's garage being vacant before a problem she couldn't solve became a problem she had to announce. He closed the laptop. The garage was quiet and the Bentley was still on its lift, and none of this had anything to do with Clause 14B, and everyone involved knew it. 6 years before he came to Harwick, Carter Mills had been the vice president of engineering at Meridian Auto Group, one of the largest mid-market automotive groups operating in North America. He had not inherited the position. He had not been guided into it through sponsorship. He had earned it through 12 years of accumulated technical credibility, through problems solved when other engineers had filed reports instead, through results documented in production data rather than in self-evaluations. His most consequential work at Meridian was the complete redesign of the company's CNC machining tolerance control system, an initiative he led across 11 production facilities over 22 months. The program reduced accumulated dimensional variance in high-cycle components by 61%. It eliminated a category of warranty failures that had been costing the company somewhere between $18 and $23 million every year. In its first 2 full years of operation, the program had saved Meridian $47 million. Carter's name had appeared in 3 industry trade publications in that period. He had not kept the clippings because he had not gone into engineering for clippings. Emily died on a Thursday morning 4 years ago. A highway collision, a clear day, no warning of any kind. Carter drove to the hospital alone and sat in a waiting room chair for 2 hours while the world quietly continued its operations outside the glass doors, and when the physician finally came to him, the news was exactly as complete and as final as the silence had been preparing him for. He took 6 weeks of family leave from Meridian. At the end of 6 weeks, he submitted his resignation in a single paragraph. He liquidated the Meridian stock options he had accumulated over 7 years of service. At the time of sale, they were worth $3.2 million. He moved to Harwick. He opened the garage. Grace was 8 years old, and he needed something he could fix. The investment account sat with a registered financial advisor who sent quarterly reports that Carter filed without reading closely. The account had grown over 4 years, steadily and without drama, the way money grows when no one is drawing it down. Owen was the only other person who knew it existed. People who knew Carter in Harwick assumed the garage was his career, his ambition, his ceiling. They were not wrong that he cared about the work. He did care about it, genuinely, without performance. But the garage was also the thing that had kept his hands occupied in the 2 years after Emily, when occupied hands were the only thing that stood between him and a kind of stillness that felt dangerous. The Porsche was not a career move. The Bentley was not a business strategy. They were hours, and hours were what he had needed, and what he had eventually run out of needing in the way he had once needed them. He had been ready for something else for a while. He had simply been waiting for a reason. Carter found the contact in his phone, Julian Frost, unchanged for 3 years, and dialed. Julian picked up on the second ring with the voice of a man who had not expected this particular number to appear on his screen on a Tuesday evening. They had been colleagues at Meridian, Julian in procurement strategy, Carter in engineering, and the friendship had survived 2 career moves and 3 time zones by virtue of being the kind that did not require constant maintenance. Julian had been director of supply chain at Apex Automotive for the past 5 years. The conversation ran 40 minutes. Julian confirmed, measuring his words as a man in his position must, that the Voss camshaft situation was accurate and that it was serious. Apex's internal engineering team had mapped the failure pattern but had not been able to identify root cause with enough specificity to design a repair protocol. The review window had a hard deadline. If no technically credible third party could identify and resolve the issue before that window closed, the contract would not be renewed, and Voss would be notified in writing. Carter took this information without comment. Then he said, "I know what the problem is." There was a pause that lasted perhaps 3 full seconds, long, in a phone conversation. Julian said carefully, "Carter, what are you doing these days?" Carter didn't answer that. He said he would be in touch, and he ended the call. The next morning, Carter met Owen at a diner 2 kilometers from the industrial park, early enough that the booths were mostly empty and the coffee came without a wait. He put 3 items on the table between them: a legal pad, a pen, and a 1-page printout showing Voss Industries' current market capitalization alongside its 12-month trading range. Owen looked at all 3. He did not touch them. Carter said he was not going to fight the eviction notice. He was not interested in court, and he was not interested in revenge. He said he wanted to buy Voss Industries. Owen studied him for a moment. "The company is currently valued at approximately $18 million on market," he said. "You have 3.2 in the account." Carter said, "I know. Sit down." Owen said, "I am sitting down." Carter said, "Then write." The plan was 3 steps. Carter laid them out with the brevity of a man who had been working through them in his head for 2 days and had already discarded the approaches that wouldn't hold. First, a conversation with Diana Marsh, Voss's chief financial officer. Her name appeared in the public record in connection with a production restructuring proposal that Voss's leadership had rejected the previous month, 1 quarter before the Apex situation became critical. Someone inside that building had identified the right solution and been overruled. Carter wanted to understand what that person knew, and to make sure she understood that her proposal was not finished, even if the leadership that had rejected it would not be the ones to implement it. Second, through a consulting entity that Owen would incorporate within 48 hours, Carter would prepare a technical report for Apex Automotive. Anonymous in attribution, identifying the precise root cause of the camshaft failures and the specific remediation protocol required to resolve them. The intent was not to destroy Voss's contract but to create the specific combination of stock pressure and operational urgency that would make an acquisition at a viable price point possible. Third, Owen would approach Hargrove Capital, a private equity fund that had invested alongside Meridian during the period of Carter's work there, and whose managing partners knew Carter's track record personally, and present a leveraged buyout structure, 51% to Carter, the remainder financed by Hargrove. Owen completed the page of notes, looked at what he had written, and looked up. His expression was the particular combination of impressed and alarmed that Carter had seen on his face exactly twice before in the years they had known each other, and both previous times had involved Carter being correct in the end. "You're using the mechanic's cover to approach Diana Marsh," Owen said. "You're using the technical report to move a stock. You're using the stock movement to create an acquisition window." He paused. "This is the same methodology you used on the Meridian tolerance audit. You build the pressure from the outside and let the structure respond to it." Carter said, "It worked then." Owen said, "You were an employee then." Carter said, "I'm better positioned now." Owen considered that for a moment, then recapped his pen. "You have 21 days. Carter picked up his coffee cup. "I need 18. 3 days later, Carter walked into a coffee shop 2 blocks from the Voss Industries headquarters and sat across from Diana Marsh. He had identified her through professional public records, her credentials, her history in manufacturing finance across 4 companies over 15 years, and the particular signal of a CFO whose formal restructuring proposal had been rejected in the same quarter the company's largest customer initiated a contract review. Diana was a careful and experienced woman. She arrived 3 minutes before the time they had agreed and ordered nothing. Carter introduced himself as an independent analyst working on a study of mid-market precision component manufacturers. He offered no business card and claimed no expertise beyond what he had legitimately earned. He asked her what she considered the most underestimated structural challenge facing companies in her sector when they tried to maintain long-term anchor relationships with Tier 1 clients. Diana spoke for 25 minutes. She was precise and professional and said nothing that crossed any line she would later regret. But she said enough. She said that companies in her sector frequently chose the speed of asset liquidation over the patience of operational investment, and that this trade looked rational on a quarterly balance sheet and was often devastating in a plant. She said that technical failures in precision manufacturing were almost never the fault of the machines themselves. They were process failures, configuration failures, failures of the gap between what the equipment had been set up to do and what the product specification actually required. She said that these failures were solvable, and that the solutions were available to anyone with the right background, and that the obstacle was never the problem itself but the willingness of leadership to invest the time the solution required rather than the time the calendar allowed. She said that she had recently submitted a plan she believed was correct, and that the plan had not moved forward and that she was uncertain about what came next. Carter listened to every sentence without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Sometimes the person who identified the right answer is still in the room when the right answer gets implemented. It just takes longer to close the gap than it should." Diana looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite name. He thanked her for the conversation, stood, shook her hand, and left. Between Day 8 and Day 12, Apex Automotive delivered a formal written request to Voss Industries for an independent third-party technical audit of the production line implicated in the camshaft tolerance failures. The document was worded as a standard evaluation procedure, but everyone who read it understood that it was a final precondition before a termination decision. Alexandra Reed called an emergency session of her engineering leadership team the afternoon the letter arrived. The meeting ran 3 hours and 20 minutes. Her head of manufacturing walked the room through 3 candidate root causes, each partially consistent with the data, each incapable of being definitively confirmed or excluded. The team dispersed without a resolution protocol. Alexandra sat in the emptied conference room for several minutes after the last person left. Trade publications reported, within 72 hours, that a significant Tier 1 components supplier with Apex exposure was under technical performance review. The description was specific enough that market analysts connected it to Voss without needing the name. In 3 consecutive trading sessions, Voss Industries' common stock fell 11%. Alexandra tracked the number from her office window and kept her face neutral in front of her staff, because what other option was there? Crestline Group contacted Voss on Day 11 to request a renegotiation meeting. The development firm's position had shifted. They were not willing to carry acquisition risk tied to a vendor under active contract review. They framed their concern as procedural. Their tone communicated something closer to retreat. Alexandra managed the call professionally and bought a week of ambiguity. After the call ended, she sat in her office alone and looked at the quarter's numbers the way a person looks at a problem they have been successfully avoiding thinking about directly. Diana Marsh presented the restructuring proposal again that same week. This time the slide package was more detailed, 3 operational scenarios with explicit financial projections, annotated risk comparisons, and a phased implementation calendar that acknowledged the compressed timeline. Alexandra listened to the entire presentation without speaking. When Diana finished, Alexandra said, "We don't have time for a restructuring program." Diana said, "We also don't have time to lose Apex." No one said anything for a few seconds, then the meeting ended. It was the first time in the tenure of their professional relationship that Alexandra had remained in a room after Diana stopped talking without already knowing what she was going to say next. Owen called Carter on Day 12 at 7 in the evening with a voice that was careful and exact. The stock had moved into range. One more significant development, he said, and the conditions for the acquisition approach would be right. Carter said, "The report is done." He had spent 11 evenings writing it, beginning each session after the garage closed and working until the language met the standard he held everything to. The analysis ran to 19 pages. The error, as Carter had understood from the moment Julian described the failure profile, was not a materials failure, not a design flaw, and not an equipment problem. It was a software configuration error in the motion controllers of the 5-axis CNC machines running the camshaft program, the thermal compensation offset, the parameter that accounts for geometric drift in the cutting path as machine temperature rises over an extended production run, had been set incorrectly relative to the thermal characteristics of the specific aluminum alloy and cutting speed combination in use. The result was a dimensional deviation that was undetectable at cold inspection temperatures and grew cumulatively during long production cycles, eventually pushing the part geometry outside the tolerance band the contract required. It was the kind of error that required both machine programming expertise and materials process knowledge to identify, and the overlap between those 2 bodies of knowledge was not large. Owen registered the consulting entity in 48 hours, a clean filing, 1 address, 1 named director. The technical report went to Julian Frost at Apex under the entity's name, attributed to an anonymous senior technical advisor. Julian called back within 40 minutes. His voice was controlled, but the direction of what he said was unmistakable. This was the most precise failure analysis in this specific technical domain that he had reviewed in 12 years of working the precision manufacturing supply chain. He wanted to know who had written it. Owen said the source had chosen to remain unidentified. Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand." He understood more than the two words covered. Apex issued a revised position to Voss 3 days later. Rather than moving to contract termination as their internal review had been tracking toward, they extended the evaluation period by 15 days under one explicit condition. Voss engage an independent technical consultant with verifiable credentials in CNC precision manufacturing to identify and remediate the specific production defect under review. The extension was not a reprieve, it was a requirement. And the requirement described a person with a profile narrow enough to produce a short list. Alexandra's assistant compiled that list. 4 names ranked by documented relevance. The third entry read C. Mills, former vice president of engineering, Meridian Auto Group. Location note, currently operating an independent automotive repair business in Harwick. Alexandra looked at the entry for a long time. She recognized the name from the industry. The Meridian Tolerance Program had not gone entirely unremarked in circles where these things were discussed. But she had not, in any of the 3 times she had thought about the mechanic in the East Block, considered the possibility that the initials were connected. She asked the assistant to verify. The verification came back in less than 5 minutes. Same person. Alexandra sat down in her chair and looked at the wall opposite her desk. On day 18, Owen Calloway submitted a formal letter of intent from Mills Hargrove Acquisition Group to the Board of Directors of Voss Industries. The offer proposed acquisition of controlling interest at $14.2 million, 40% below the company's peak valuation, 22% above the current depressed trading price. The terms committed the acquiring group to retaining all existing employees in their current roles, to making stabilization of the Apex Automotive contract the primary operational mandate of the first 30 days, and to investing $2.1 million in production line reconfiguration within the initial 90-day period. Carter Mills was named as principal. The Hargrove Capital letterhead appeared alongside his. The board received the letter on a Thursday morning and convened an emergency session that afternoon. Alexandra Reed was not informed of the meeting until after it had adjourned. Crestline Group sent their withdrawal letter on day 19. Changed circumstances. Best regards. The real estate transaction that had been the cornerstone of Alexandra's fiscal recovery plan was gone. The board met a second time that same evening. Owen received a call that night at 20 minutes past 11 and listened more than he spoke. When he set the phone down, he told Carter that the board was prepared to enter formal acquisition discussions. Their condition: the acquiring principal must appear in person before final documents were executed to present technical credentials and operational intent. On day 20, Carter Mills walked into the Voss Industries boardroom for the first time. He wore a dark gray suit. It still fit precisely, because it had been built for a purpose and he had kept it maintained even when the purpose had been set aside. No tie. He placed 3 documents on the conference table without preamble. His engineering dossier from Meridian Auto Group, which included the full documented history of the CNC Tolerance Control Initiative, along with independent third-party verification of the results. The technical report that had already circulated to Apex, which he now formally attributed to himself, and a 90-day operational plan for Voss Industries, specific to their equipment inventory, their current staff structure, and the contractual obligations they were carrying with Apex. He spoke for approximately 30 minutes. He answered questions for 45 more. One board member asked why, given his background, he had spent 4 years running a small garage in a mid-sized industrial park. Carter looked at the table for a moment before looking back at the faces around it. He said, "I needed the time. I have enough now." No one pressed him for elaboration. In the context of what he had placed in front of them, the statement held its own weight. A second board member asked whether Carter intended to bring in outside management for the transition period. Carter said no. The plan he had presented was the plan he intended to execute, with the existing team, beginning the week the documents were signed. A third member asked about the Hargrove capital arrangement and whether Carter's operational decisions would be subject to Hargrove's approval. Carter explained the structure cleanly. Hargrove held a passive financial stake, no operational authority, and had accepted this condition explicitly because the people at Hargrove who had worked with Carter during the Meridian years did not require a seat at the table to know what they were getting. The room was quiet for a moment after that. Then the board chair said they would need the evening to complete their review, and Carter thanked them for their time and left without lingering. On day 21, the exact calendar morning by which Carter Mills was legally required to have removed his equipment and vacated the East Block premises of the Harwick Industrial Park, the acquisition of Voss Industries was executed in full. Carter Mills signed as principal on behalf of Mills Hargrove Acquisition Group. He was, as of that morning, the controlling owner of the company whose chief executive had handed him an eviction notice 3 weeks earlier. He was also, incidentally, the legal owner of the building he had been instructed to leave. Diana Marsh received notification from a board member before the public announcement went out. She called Alexandra immediately. Alexandra did not ask her to repeat it. She asked for a single meeting, the two of them, no legal representation, no assistance, with Carter Mills. The request passed through Owen to Carter without commentary. Carter confirmed. They met at the garage. Carter had moved nothing. The Bentley was still on the lift in Bay 3, and the radio was still playing from the shelf near the back wall where it had always been. Alexandra arrived alone. She wore the same black suit she had worn 3 weeks earlier, and her posture was the same, straight, deliberate, controlled. Carter was at the workbench when she came through the roll-up door. He did not look up immediately. There was a part he was checking. He checked it. She stood near the entrance for a moment and looked at the garage in a way she had not looked at it on her previous visit, not with assessment, with attention. Then she asked him directly, had he known that Monday morning when she handed him the notice what he intended to do? Carter set the part down. He looked at her without heat. He said, "I knew after you left. Before that I had no particular interest in Voss Industries," she said. "I assumed you were a mechanic." Carter said, "I am a mechanic." The statement was not defensive. It was not ironic. It was the same tone he used for everything that was simply true. That part hasn't changed. She asked what he planned to do with the company. He told her directly, stabilize the Apex contract in the first 30 days, correct the CNC thermal compensation configuration across all 6 affected machines, and implement the production line restructuring that Diana Marsh had proposed months ago, and that should have been approved when it was first put on the table. Alexandra listened to the list without objecting, because the list was correct and she had known it was correct for longer than she had been willing to act on it. What Carter did not mention, in that conversation or in any conversation that followed, was the eviction notice, the 14B clause, the coordinated effort to foreclose every available commercial space within 5 kilometers of his garage. He did not hold it up. He did not use it. He was not in this building because he had wanted to undo what she had done. He was here because he could see the problem, he could see the solution, and she had given him a reason to look. Alexandra Reed stood in Carter Mills's garage for 11 minutes. At the end of those 11 minutes, she looked at him one more time, not with warmth, not with regret as a performance, but with the specific acknowledgement that one professional gives another when the evidence is complete and unambiguous, and there is nothing useful left to contest. Then she walked out through the roll-up door into the afternoon, and the sound of her footsteps faded across the concrete of the industrial park, and Carter turned back to the Bentley. 3 weeks after the acquisition closed, the Voss Industries production floor was running a fully corrected motion controller configuration on all 6 of its 5-axis CNC machines. Carter had supervised the recalibration process directly, working with the plant engineers over 9 consecutive days to validate the thermal compensation offsets against real production temperatures and verify the corrected geometry against the Apex specification. The camshaft tolerance failures stopped in the first production cycle after the correction was applied. Apex Automotive conducted their independent verification, reviewed 3 weeks of corrected output data, and signed a 3-year contract renewal with revised terms that were more favorable to Voss than the agreement they were replacing. Diana Marsh was appointed Chief Operating Officer. She had been right from the beginning, and the organization had finally arrived at a point where that mattered more than the calendar. She accepted the appointment in a short written response, updated her professional information, and returned to work the following morning with a capital expenditure proposal she had been carrying in draft form for the better part of a year. She did not need a ceremony to mark the transition, because she had never been motivated by ceremony. Alexandra Reed submitted her resignation 2 weeks after the board completed its final vote on the operational restructuring plan. Her departure statement used the professional language that such transitions require and said nothing more than was necessary. The decision had been hers, made on her own schedule without being asked, without being pushed. In the full accounting of everything that had taken place across those 3 weeks, it was the one move that belonged entirely to her. Carter Mills kept the garage. He was the building's owner now, which made him his own landlord. A fact Owen found quietly satisfying and Carter found primarily administrative. The roll-up door still opened at 5:30 every morning. The fluorescent lights still blinked once before steadying. The radio still played the jazz station from the shelf where it had spent 4 years and from which Carter had never moved it. Because there had never been a reason to, and because some things are better left in the place they have always been. Owen stopped by the garage on a weekday evening in the 4th week after the acquisition, sat down in the old wooden chair he had always used near the second bay door, and watched Carter work for several minutes in comfortable silence before asking how it felt to be a factory owner. Carter was turning a fitting by hand on the undercarriage of the Bentley Continental, the same car that had been waiting on the lift since before any of this started, patient as everything old and well-made tends to be. He did not stop working, he said. I'm still getting used to it. But fixing the machine feels the same. Owen watched him, the fitting seated. The Bentley settled a fraction on the lift the way a good part always does when the person installing it knows exactly how much force is needed and applies that amount and no more. The car was ready. Carter lowered the lift slowly, walked around the Continental once in the quiet of the garage, checked the fluid levels the way he always did, not because he expected to find something, but because checking was part of what made the work complete. Outside, the Harwick Industrial Park was settling into evening. Inside, the radio played something slow and unhurried, the kind of music that understands the difference between holding a note and filling space. Carter turned off the overhead light in Bay 3, left the radio where it was, and locked the door behind him from the outside. He had work in the morning. He always had work in the morning, and that had never been the problem.